Jake Sullivan, welcome to The National. Thank you for joining me today. President Trump and President Putin, we understand, are speaking as we do this interview. What is the least worst outcome for Ukraine?
For me, the least worst outcome for Ukraine is actually a pretty good outcome for Ukraine, and it would be Ukraine emerging from this war as a sovereign, united, consolidated democracy integrated with the West and with a strong military deterrent so Russia can never do this again. I think that's a possible outcome, even if there's going to have to be some kind of territorial discussion between Ukraine and Russia. In order to get that outcome, though, the United States is going to have to increase pressure on Russia because right now Vladimir Putin thinks he's winning this war.
You think Putin wants to drag this war out? How does he tap the president along?
So if Putin had his way, he would continue fighting in Ukraine, continue putting pressure on Ukraine, both on the front lines and by terrorizing the Ukrainian population with drone and missile strikes, because his ultimate goal is subjugating the country. That being said, to your question, he also doesn't want to lose President Trump. He doesn't want President Trump to flip on him. So he's going to have to show some willingness to engage towards peace, and he's begun to do that with these talks in Istanbul. So I think what he'll say to President Trump is, I want peace too. I need some conditions fulfilled. They're impossible conditions for Ukraine. And he'll try to string things along in a diplomatic process while fighting on the battlefield. That's what I think he will try to do. Whether he succeeds or not is another question.
You talk about the differential between a false peace and a real peace. Does a minerals agreement between the United States and Ukraine really lay the foundations for a real peace? You need military deterrent to deliver a real peace. And that's not really on the cards for Ukraine, is it?
Well, a military deterrent could be on the cards, not in the form of an Article 5 security guarantee. President Trump and his team have taken that off. But in the form of continued support from the West to Ukraine to build out its military capabilities, which are considerable, so that it can deter and defend against future Russian aggression. That is possible. The minerals deal, to me, that was more symbolic. That was more about an assertion by the current president that the U.S. is getting something for the aid that we're giving to Ukraine. I don't think it's going to bear out as being very relevant to the future of Ukraine or the United States.
Can we pivot to the Middle East? Last week was a heck of a week in terms of Saudi, Qatar, and the UAE. The theater was pretty stupendous. Can you give me your superlative that sums up last week's presidential visit to the Gulf?
Well, there was a boldness in what President Trump did because he acted fast and he acted big. Now, I don't agree with some of the things he did. Other things he did, I do agree with. For example, trying to drive forward on direct negotiations for Iran in a nuclear deal that could end up looking a lot like the deal that President Obama cut. But one of the things that really stood out to me was President Trump basically said, I'm not entering the Middle East through Israel. I'm entering the Middle East through the Gulf because I see in these Gulf leaders partners for peace, which is what he's trying to drive at in a bunch of these things. And I don't see that as much in Israel. That to me was a striking moment.
Are we shifting the balance of power, as it were, to Gulf first over Israel first?
I don't know about balance of power, but what I think the president is signaling is that in order to bring about economic growth and a reduction or de-escalation in violence or threats, he sees the Gulf as a partner of first resort more than he sees Israel. Now, does that mean the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to be transformed in some way? I don't see that yet, at least. But does it mean that right now the current occupant of the Oval Office is focused more on what he can do with these Gulf countries around deals and around, trying to achieve something vis-a-vis Iran or Syria or Yemen or other places? Yeah.
There was a standing ovation when he announced that he was removing the sanctions from Syria, and then he went on to meet the leader the next day. Some say there was a coronation of Mohammed bin Salman during that trip. How do you see the elevation of Saudi?
I think President Trump has a highly personalized style when it comes to diplomacy, and that's on display at 10 out of 10 when you're dealing with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He was venerated, with the arrival ceremony, and he returned the favor in kind. That's two people who see this personalized diplomacy as central to their way of operating.
He bypassed physically and politically Bibi Netanyahu. What's the consequence of that? What was the message in that?
President Trump has been very clear when it comes to the Middle East. He wants to see an end to the conflicts and an opportunity for deals. Pretty straightforward. Now, he's basically told Bibi, you can do as you please in Gaza. And that has been an unfolding, horrific human tragedy over the course of many months, but also over the course of the last few weeks. But I think the main message that he's sending is, you do what you're doing and I'm not going to stop you, but I'm going to do my own thing and I'm not necessarily going to listen to you when you give me advice on various other elements of Middle East policy.
Is he cornering Bibi Netanyahu? He's negotiating directly with Iran, directly with Hamas. He really is sidelining Bibi.
Look, I think what he's saying is, I'm moving forward on an agenda relative to Syria, Iran, the Gulf, and if Israel wants to be a part of that, fine. If they don't, fine. So I don't know if cornering is the right word, but he's clearly sending a message that he's going to proceed without necessarily close coordination with the Israeli Prime Minister.
European leaders have been very vocal in the past couple of days in regards to aid and the crisis within Gaza. Is this a moment where aid really needs to get through and there needs to be action taken? The president alluded as much at the end of last week.
Yes, and we've seen reports that maybe they are going to restart aid. We'll have to see if that's actually followed through. This is something when I was National Security Advisor day in, day out, I was working on trying to get more aid into Gaza to avert a famine that was long warned about. We didn't get enough aid in, but we got a considerable amount in, and I believe we did avert that famine during the time the last administration was in office. For the past many weeks, nothing has gotten in, nothing. And that is a big difference from what was happening before. Now I hope finally the folks in Washington have woken up to say, we have to push the Israelis to allow aid in, and let's see if that will flow.
What is the consequence of this Trump administration negotiating directly with Hamas?
Well, in this case, what they were able to do in that conversation was get out that last remaining living American hostage, Edan Alexander. I spoke with Edan's father after he was released. I worked very closely with that family. We got other Americans out in the Biden administration. We weren't able to get Edan out. I think it's a great thing for our country that he did get out, and I think that's the main result of the direct negotiation with Hamas.
To Iran, how ready are they to do a deal, do you think?
Look, if you're not in the room, it's a little hard to have the feel, and I spent a lot of time in rooms with Iranian diplomats negotiating in the run-up to the JCPOA. I would say, though, that Iran is signaling in every way they possibly can that they want to do a deal. And the real question is, what is going to be the shape of that deal, especially what is going to be the status of Iranian enrichment? And there, I think there's going to be an intense negotiation between Iran and the US, but also an intense negotiation within the Trump administration about what kind of deal they will accept.
You would say that this is one of those policy issues that can cause a major split within the GOP and a real headache for Trump.
We have already seen, just based on what the administration has said publicly about the deal over the last few weeks, real pushback from quarters within the Republican Party saying we will not tolerate any deal that doesn't have complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. So I think this does have the potential to drive a genuine wedge in the Republican Party, and not a quiet one, but one where you have quite vocal proponents of a particularly stringent deal. And I think they will continue to be vocal if they feel the deal is not going in their direction. But let's see what happens, because I think what we have seen from the administration is more flexibility on these issues than from some of the hardliners in the Republican Party.
So let's flick the agenda. Let's talk about success outcomes with Russia, success outcomes with Iran. That means more oil. Oil has crashed this year, just as OPEC Plus put more barrels on the market. First of all, why is OPEC Plus putting more barrels on the market? Is it political persuasion from the US administration?
I'm not obviously inhabiting the mind of Mohammed bin Salman or his energy minister, but my perception is that this decision was not taken because it was a request from the United States. It was taken because Saudi Arabia had, from its own national reserves, been holding back dramatically its production of oil, its sales of oil to the international market, and it watched many other countries sell more and more, both within OPEC Plus and outside, and it finally said, we can't keep, just holding ourselves back. And I think that was the strategic decision that they took. And as you say, it's had a big impact because between that and other dynamics, the price of oil has really come down. And if there's an Iran deal, I think it will come down further. So we could really see a really soft oil price in the period ahead, which is good news at the pump for consumers, but it does create other kinds of dynamics around decisions relative to oil production in the United States and elsewhere.
Well, when you say soft, we've already had a pretty brutal 2025. So what does soft mean, and what does that mean for the frackers? Because you can't have a fracking industry at sub $50, sub $60.
So I'm not an oil expert.
No.
It's always hard for me to say, but I would note that given the direction of travel of the oil price, the question of what it will mean for the fracking industry in the United States is a real question, and I know that they must be watching that day in and day out.
The one topic that is pervasive, whether it's financial news, economic news, or markets, is the hegemony, the exceptionalism of the United States of America from an economic point of view and from a defense policy, the hegemony of the United States of America. From what you have seen, has this administration damaged the defense hegemony position of the United States of America?
Look, there is no doubt that this administration has damaged the alliance network of the U.S. that has formed the backbone of our leadership in the world. And that damage is real, it's considerable, and it's particularly acute with respect to the transatlantic alliance. And you talk to people across Europe, and they, a year ago, were talking with us about de-risking from China. Now they're talking amongst themselves about de-risking from the United States, including de-risking in the defense industrial base, in addition to other areas. So this is real. This damage is real, and it's something that we are going to have to contend with, because if there's one thing Beijing was hoping for over the last few years, it was a weakening of American alliances, and unfortunately American policy is very much contributing to that without Beijing having to lift a finger.
If you look at the theater that we've seen since this administration has started, the one thing that came to my mind when I was in Saudi Arabia last week, which was the president did sound very loyal to his allies. And the question that goes through my mind is, perhaps it's not as a bigger breakdown in multilateralism as we think. It's the theater of maximum rhetoric.
Well, I think one thing that's happening is President Trump builds his relationships on a very personal basis and particularly likes certain kinds of leaders. And some of those leaders are in the Gulf, and he has good relationships with them, and he sees the possibility of doing the kinds of deals that were announced. And so I do think you're going to see strong and sustained relationships in the Gulf. It's a different question, though, when it comes to many of America's traditional democratic allies in both Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. There, I think the story looks quite different, and the cost to America strategically, in my view, is real.
Let's close with this. You referred to the president's trip to the Gulf as bold in action, bold in rhetoric. You've negotiated the JCPOA. You've negotiated long and hard with many of the protagonists here. What is the piece of advice that you would give to this team advising now on the Iran deal?
Well, when I'm asked about giving advice to them publicly, I'm always very reticent, because when I was sitting in the seat, lots of people gave me lots of unsolicited advice, so I'm always, leery to do so. And my advice certainly with this administration would be unsolicited. But, a deep lesson for me in going through the process of the Iran deal is, recognizing the clock and that time really is on our side, in my view. Iran is under pressure, and we don't have to necessarily rush to complete a deal. On the other hand, that has to be balanced against making sure you seize the opportunity so the window doesn't close. So striking that balance to me is the most important thing, and I think if they get to an Iran nuclear deal, I will be a supporter of that, as I was of the last deal that Trump walked out of, and I will welcome many Republicans to join me in supporting President Trump in doing that deal.
Jake Sullivan, thank you for joining me on The National.
Thank you for having me.